The night was cold outside, but inside the house everything looked warm and full of light. The Christmas tree stood tall in the living room, covered with golden ornaments and shining stars. Children laughed, music played softly, and the smell of sweet food filled the air. Everyone in the family had gathered for the holiday. It looked like a perfect evening. The grandparents sat proudly in their chairs, handing out gifts one by one. Each child came forward with excitement, tearing open boxes to find toys, clothes, or shiny surprises. The room filled with joy as laughter echoed again and again. But in the corner of the room, one boy waited quietly. His eyes were bright, and his small hands held onto the box that was finally given to him. It was the father's son. He was only 7 years old, gentle, and full of innocent hope. The father watched him closely, smiling softly, thinking this would be the moment his boy would finally feel loved by the grandparents. The boy slowly opened his gift box. The sound of paper tearing stopped everyone's talking for a moment. His small fingers lifted the lid, his eyes ready to shine with joy. But what he saw inside froze him. The box was empty. The boy stared in silence, his smile fading. His hands shook as he looked again, hoping maybe something had slipped under the paper. But there was nothing. Only emptiness. The room grew quiet, and all eyes turned toward him. Tears welled up in the boy's eyes. One tear fell on his cheek, shining in the light of the Christmas tree. He whispered, almost too softly to hear, "Why, nothing?" The father's heart broke in that moment. His fists tightened, but he said nothing. He looked at his parents, waiting for them to explain. The grandmother leaned back in her chair, her lips curving into a cold smile. "That boy doesn't need anything," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the silence. "He should learn his place." Some family members looked away, embarrassed. Others laughed nervously, pretending it was only a joke. But the boy's tears kept falling. He held the empty box to his chest, as if hoping it could still give him something. The father stood frozen. His mind raced with memories of his own childhood, when he too had felt small under his parents' cruel words. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but his voice was locked behind his pain. The boy looked up at his father with wet eyes, searching for comfort. The father bent down, placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, and whispered softly, "Let's go." The room stayed silent as the father stood tall, holding his son's hand. He didn't look back at his parents. He didn't say a word. He simply walked out of the room, step by step, his son beside him. The door closed behind them. Outside, the cold air hit their faces, but inside the father's heart, fire was burning. The insult was heavy, the pain deep. But in his silence, a promise was made. A promise that this night would never be forgotten, and so the story begins. The night after the Christmas party was silent. The small boy sat on his bed, holding his blanket close, his eyes still red from tears. The empty box lay on the floor beside him. He had not thrown it away. Even though it carried no gift, it carried the memory of shame. The father stood at the door, watching his son. His chest felt heavy, but he walked in slowly. He sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to smile, but the boy's voice cut through his heart. "Dad," the boy whispered, "why don't they love me?" The words pierced deeper than any knife. The father wanted to answer, to tell him something that would heal his little heart. But no answer came. He could not lie. He could not say his parents loved the boy, because their actions spoke louder than any words. He placed his hand on his son's head and stroked his hair gently. "It's not you, my son. You are perfect. It's them. They don't see you the way they should." The boy nodded, but tears still rolled down his cheeks. "But why me? Everyone got something. Why only me?" The father closed his eyes, fighting back his own tears. He remembered his childhood, the cold stares, the cruel words, the endless feeling of being less than enough. His parents had done this to him too, and now they were doing it to his child. Rage built inside him, but he didn't show it. His son didn't need his anger. His son needed peace. He leaned closer and whispered, "One day, they will understand what they did. One day, they will regret it. But until then, remember this, you don't need their gifts. You already have something stronger. You have me." The boy wrapped his arms around his father tightly, and for a moment, silence filled the room again. But inside the father's heart, the silence was not calm. It was heavy. It was the silence of a man who had been pushed too far. The next morning, life seemed normal. The boy went to school, holding his small bag. The father went to work, but his mind stayed on that empty box. Every sound, every word at his office felt distant. All he could see was his son's tearful face. At lunch, he sat alone in his car, staring at nothing. The question repeated in his head, "Why don't they love me?" He thought about calling his parents, confronting them, shouting at them for their cruelty. But then he stopped. He realized something. His silence could be stronger than his words. His absence could hurt them more than his anger. That evening, when he picked up his son from school, the boy smiled for the first time since the party. The father saw it, and his heart softened. He thought, "This is my focus now. Not them." Him, the grandparents did not call that night. They did not ask about the boy. They did not even pretend to care. But for the father, this silence was the beginning of a new decision that he promised himself in that quiet moment while watching his son sleep, that he would never again let his parents humiliate his child. The fire inside him was no longer only pain. It was turning into something else. A plan, and though the grandparents did not know it yet, the price of their cruelty was coming closer with every silent day. Days turned into a week. The cold of winter spread outside, but inside the father's house, things were slowly changing. The boy was calmer now. His eyes were not so heavy with sadness, though sometimes at night he still looked at the empty box before turning away from it. The father had placed the box on a high shelf, out of sight. He didn't throw it away. He couldn't. To him, the empty box was no longer just a gift. It was a reminder, a symbol of everything his parents had done to him, and now to his child. The grandparents, on the other hand, were silent too. No calls came. No visits. They sat in their big house, expecting the father to call first, as he always had in the past after every fight. But this time, there was only silence. The grandfather sat in his chair one evening, frowning. "He'll come back," he said to his wife. "He always does. He has no one else." The grandmother smirked. "Yes. He'll return. He cannot live without our family." But both were wrong. At the father's home, there was laughter, small, fragile, but real. The boy began to smile more. The father bought him small gifts with his own money, a book, a toy car, a scarf to keep him warm. They were not expensive, but they were filled with love. And every time the boy opened a gift, his eyes lit up, and the father felt stronger. Each day without the grandparents was like a wound healing slowly. The father realized he didn't need their approval anymore. His son didn't need their pride. What they needed was peace, and they were finally finding it. One Saturday morning, the boy asked, "Dad, are we going to Grandma's house?" The father paused, then knelt down and looked into his son's eyes. "No, son. Not now. We don't need to go there." "Why?" the boy asked softly. "Because," the father answered, "some places don't give us love. And we only go where love lives." The boy thought about it for a moment, then nodded. For the first time, he didn't argue. He didn't ask again. He understood in his own quiet way. Meanwhile, the grandparents began to feel something unusual: silence. Their phone did not ring. Their door did not open. Their grandson's laugh did not fill their house. The days felt colder, the rooms emptier. They told themselves it was nothing. But deep down, they began to feel a shadow of worry. At night, the grandmother lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Why hasn't he called? She whispered. The grandfather grumbled. He will. He always does. But her heart was not convinced. Something felt different this time, and she was right. For the father, distance was no longer painful. It was becoming a shield. The longer he stayed away, the stronger he felt. He realized that silence could be a punishment sharper than words. The boy slept peacefully that night, safe in his father's arms. But across town, the grandparents sat in their grand home, surrounded by wealth but empty of warmth. The distance had only begun, but already it was teaching them a lesson they would never forget. 2 weeks passed in silence. The father did not call. The boy did not visit. For the first time, the grandparents' house felt strange, like something important was missing. The big rooms were still filled with furniture, the dining table still carried expensive dishes, but the sound of laughter was gone. The grandmother tried to act strong. She told herself it was nothing, that her son would soon come back. But the silence began to eat her pride from the inside. The change became more clear when they went to a family dinner. Relatives and friends gathered in a big hall, dressed in bright clothes. People laughed, exchanged gifts, and shared stories about their children and grandchildren. Someone asked loudly, "Where's your grandson tonight? We haven't seen him since Christmas." The room went quiet for a moment. The grandmother forced a smile. "Oh, he is busy. He will come next time." Another voice rose from the table. "Busy? A child? He should be here with his grandparents." The grandfather tightened his jaw. His pride was touched. "He's fine," he said firmly, trying to end the talk, but whispers had already begun. People exchanged looks. Some shook their heads. Others whispered to each other, their voices low but sharp enough to be heard. "Strange, why don't they bring the boy anymore? Something must have happened. They always brag about their grandson, but now he is missing." The grandmother's face burned with shame. She pretended not to hear, but every whisper cut her deeper. As the evening went on, the gossip spread like fire. Every time the grandparents tried to join the conversation, someone asked again, "Where's the boy? Why is he not here?" The grandmother's smile grew weaker. The grandfather's anger grew stronger. For the first time, they realized their control over their son was breaking. Back at home that night, the grandmother paced the floor. "They're talking about us," she said, her voice trembling. "They think something is wrong." The grandfather slammed his hand on the table. "Let them talk. He will come back. He always does." But deep down, he wasn't sure anymore. Meanwhile, in the father's home, things were different. The boy was sitting with his father, playing with a small toy car. His laughter filled the room, warm and pure. The father listened and smiled. It was the kind of sound he never wanted to lose again. The father didn't know what people were saying at the dinner, but he didn't care. For him, distance had already become freedom. Still, the gossip grew. Each passing day, the grandparents heard more whispers, more questions. Their friends started to notice the absence. Some even looked at them with pity, as if they had lost something precious, and maybe they had. The grandmother sat by the window one evening, staring at the street outside. The snow was falling slowly, covering everything in white. She whispered to herself, "Why hasn't he called? Why hasn't he come back?" For the first time in her life, she felt something she had never truly felt before, fear. The silence of her son was no longer just silence. It was a message. A warning. A punishment. The gossip outside their home was turning into a storm, and deep inside, the grandparents knew they had started it themselves. The pressure of silence had grown too heavy. Days turned into weeks, and the grandparents could no longer ignore the truth. Their pride was cracking, their reputation was falling, and their friends' whispers were getting louder. One cold evening, the grandmother stood at the window, her hands shaking. "We have to go to him," she said finally. "We have to face him." The grandfather resisted. His pride was still strong. "No. He should come to us. He always does. But deep inside, even he knew things were different now. Their son's silence was not weakness. It was strength. So the next morning, they dressed in heavy coats and drove through the falling snow. The road was long and silent, neither of them speaking. Each bump in the road felt like the weight of their guilt pressing down harder. When they reached the small house, the grandmother hesitated. She held her husband's arm. What if he doesn't open the door? She whispered. The grandfather knocked loudly, his voice echoing in the quiet street. Inside, the father was sitting with his son. The knock made the boy jump, and fear instantly filled his eyes. He recognized the sound. Dad, he whispered, it's them. The father's face turned calm, but his heart burned. He stood up, walked to the door, and opened it slowly. The grandparents stood there, their proud posture weaker than ever. Snow clung to their coats, and their eyes carried shame. The grandmother forced a smile. We came to see you, she said softly. And the boy. The father looked at them with cold, steady eyes. His silence was stronger than any words. The boy hid behind his father, peeking out only for a second. His small hands clutched his father's sweater tightly, as if afraid they might take him away. The grandfather cleared his throat. We only wanted to talk. The father finally spoke, his voice calm but sharp, like ice. Alk? You gave my son an empty box on Christmas. Do you remember that? The grandmother's smile broke. Her lips trembled. It was only a mistake. The father shook his head slowly. No. It was not a mistake. It was cruelty. The boy's eyes filled with tears as he whispered, Dad, I don't want them here. The father placed a hand on his son's shoulder, comforting him. Then he looked at his parents with steady anger. You gave my son nothing, he said firmly. Now you will live with nothing. You gave him an empty box. Now you will carry empty hearts. The words struck like thunder. The grandmother lowered her head, ashamed. The grandfather clenched his jaw, but he could not argue. Deep down, he knew it was true. The father slowly closed the door, leaving them standing outside in the falling snow. For the first time in their lives, the grandparents felt powerless. The boy looked up at his father, his eyes full of trust. The father hugged him tightly, whispering, You will never be humiliated again. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the grandparents' footsteps. Their pride had brought them here, but now all they carried was silence and regret. The door closed with a soft but final sound. The grandparents stood outside in the snow, their breaths visible in the cold air. For the first time, they felt the sting of rejection, not from strangers, but from their own blood. The grandmother's lips trembled as she whispered, He shut us out, like we are nothing. The grandfather stayed silent. His pride, once tall as a mountain, now felt small as dust. The snow kept falling on their shoulders as they walked slowly back to their car. No words were spoken on the drive home. Their silence was heavier than the storm outside. That night, the grandparents sat in their big house. The lights were on, the fire was burning, but the rooms felt colder than ever. The sound of their grandson's laughter was missing, and the emptiness echoed louder than any noise. The grandmother broke down first. She sat at the dining table, covering her face with her hands. I should not have done it, she cried. I should not have humiliated him. He is only a child. The grandfather stared at the fire. He remembered the look in his son's eyes, the sharp, cold anger, the silent strength. That look haunted him. For years, he had believed he was the powerful one. But now he understood. His son had finally broken free. Meanwhile, in the father's home, the atmosphere was different. The boy was slowly healing. That night, as the father tucked him into bed, the boy asked softly, Dad, are they going to come back? The father smiled gently and brushed his hair. Maybe. But you don't need to worry. You are safe here. The boy closed his eyes, finally at peace. For the first time since Christmas, he fell asleep without tears, but across town, sleep did not come so easily for the grandparents. The grandmother tossed and turned, replaying the moment she gave the boy the empty box. She could still see his little face, the way his tears rolled down. Way, he whispered, why nothing? Her guilt grew heavier with every passing hour. The grandfather finally spoke in the darkness. We destroyed something tonight. We pushed too far. The grandmother whispered back, do you think he will ever forgive us? The grandfather shook his head. Not soon. Maybe not ever. The next day, the whispers in society grew louder. Friends who once respected them now looked at them with questioning eyes. Why doesn't your son visit? Why doesn't your grandson come anymore? Every question was a knife. The grandparents smiled in public, pretending everything was fine. But behind closed doors, their hearts were breaking. The regret grew heavier day by day. The grandmother tried to call, but the phone was never answered. The grandfather tried to act strong, but deep inside, he felt weaker than ever. At night, they sat together in silence, staring at the fire that no longer gave them warmth. They had thought they were teaching a lesson. Instead, they had lost the most important bond of all, and now, the punishment had begun. Not by shouting, not by fighting, but by silence, distance, and regret that would never leave them. Winter slowly passed, but the cold inside the grandparents' house never left. Their home was still large, still filled with fine furniture and decorations, but it no longer felt alive. Every corner reminded them of what was missing, the little boy's smile, his footsteps, his laughter. The grandmother sat each evening by the window, staring at the street. She hoped to see her son's car, hoped to hear a knock at the door. But the road stayed empty, and the knock never came. The grandfather buried himself in silence. Once proud, once respected, he now walked with his head lower. At family gatherings, whispers followed them. Relatives asked polite questions, but their eyes carried judgment. Friends who once admired them now spoke behind their backs. They pushed too far, people whispered, they lost their son's respect. Even their grandson doesn't want to see them. Each word was like a stone, heavy and sharp. Their pride, which had once made them feel powerful, was now broken into pieces. Meanwhile, in the father's home, life bloomed again. The boy was happier, stronger. He spent time drawing, laughing, and playing with his father. Every small gift his father gave him carried more love than all the expensive presents in the world. One evening, the boy hugged his father and said, Dad, I don't need them anymore. I only need you. Those words healed the father more than anything else. For years, he had carried the weight of his parents' cruelty. Now he realized he no longer needed their approval. He had built something better, love, respect, and peace inside his own home, but the grandparents could not escape the price of what they had done. Loneliness grew like a shadow in their house. Their chairs stayed empty at family dinners. Their phones stayed quiet during holidays. Their friends stopped visiting. The grandmother cried often now, whispering, why did we do this? Why did we give him nothing? The grandfather, once so proud, could only sit in silence. Deep down, he knew the answer. They had chosen cruelty over kindness, and now karma had chosen them. On the next Christmas, their house was silent. No decorations, no laughter, no family. They sat at the table alone, 2 plates in front of them, food untouched. The grandmother stared at the empty chair where her grandson once sat. Tears filled her eyes. It is empty, she whispered. Just like the box we gave him. The grandfather closed his eyes, his face heavy with regret. He finally understood. That one empty gift had not only humiliated a child, it had destroyed their family. Outside, snow fell quietly. Across town, the father and son sat by their own Christmas tree. They laughed together, warm and full of love. Their house was small, but their hearts were full. The story had come full circle. The grandparents had given emptiness, and in return, they received emptiness, and the father's final thought was simple but true, respect and love are the real gifts. If you take them away, you will pay the price.